Hello, this is Pastor Travis from A Faithful Dad. We are in chapter 8 on Jesus' journey to joy and a family guide to joy in all circumstances, joy in pain. And Jesus knew joy because he anguished in pain. We're going to explore that together in this very tender and difficult topic. Stay tuned. So this chapter in joy and pain is particularly difficult because joy and pain are not two words that we encounter in the same sentence, much less in our own lives. Joy and pain just do not seem to go together. And obviously there's joy through the pain. The fourth statement of Jesus is saying from the cross is our key verse for this chapter. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46, about 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus anguished. This was a very difficult time. Surely he took up our sorrows, took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted, says Isaiah 53, verse 3. Now, anguish is defined as mental or physical pain or suffering, and Jesus knew pain. Fully God and fully man, Jesus anguished in pain far beyond what we can imagine. And really, that is the point that, when we consider Jesus' pain throughout his life, culminating at the cross, I share in one of in fact, the first video, just the medical explanation from a physician's point of view of what Jesus was going through and just how difficult that was for him. Jesus also talks a lot about his own pain. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus encountered pain. It was on a scale, and a spectrum. There was mental, public ridicule, to physical pain, the pain on the cross. And Jesus would share with his disciples, what was going on. It says, Matthew 16:21 says, from that time on, Jesus began to say plainly to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed, on the third day be raised to life. Again, Matthew chapter 16, verse 21. So the question is, how did Jesus respond to the high priest regarding his accusers? Here they are. They're in his face. They're all over. I can just see them swarming. We know what it looked like in the Passion of the Christ, but you can just see them trying to trip Jesus on his words. And they would ask him. They said, "Aren't you going to answer? What are these charges these men are bringing against you?" But it says in the scriptures, but Jesus remained silent. Matthew 26:62-63. He remained silent. Incredible. And that takes us to an important lesson learned. Lesson learned number 70. In pain, sometimes our best option is to remain silent like Jesus did. To remain silent, because everything we want to do is scream out, cry, bellow, wail. But sometimes, like Jesus led here, it's best to remain quiet. So as we continue with joy and pain and Jesus' passion, this is where he's being convicted of crimes he did not commit, but certainly Pilate sentenced Jesus to inhumane pain. At the hands of Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, Jesus' pain escalated. I oftentimes think of John 19:1. It's among the Bible's most underrated, understated passages. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. How long did it take me to say that? 5 seconds? But that to me is, we can say that sentence one short breath, but the flogging that Jesus endured would leave most of us breathless and probably lifeless. Those condemned to crucifixion often didn't survive the flogging beforehand. Jesus did, but at great cost. And Jesus knew joy because he anguished in pain. John 19, verses 1-3 says this, Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and dressed him in a purple robe. And then they went up again to him and said, Hail, King of the Jews, and slapping him in the face. Again, John chapter 19, verses 1-3. Ouch. If Pilate had any hopes that Jesus' brutal scourging would placate the Jewish leaders or the pacifier crowd, his next interaction with them revealed both his cowardice and his condemnation. We go here into the scriptures to John chapter 19, verses 14 to 16. "Here's your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Again, John chapter 19, 14 to 16. Just think of the pain that Jesus would have felt in that he's being condemned. He's dying for you and for me. By now, Jesus was approaching the ultimate earthly suffering he would face, crucifixion. And I must say, this looks forward to our chapter 11, joy in dying to self. But it does impart to us a lesson learned, what I call lesson learned number 72. Very difficult to say, easier to say, difficult to go through. And it's lesson learned number 72, which is this: God uses inhumane physical pain to work glorious results. And that's hard for us to hear, isn't it? We don't want to necessarily go through that pain. We want the joy, but going through that physical pain, and certainly that's what Jesus did. So after the break, we're going to go through what Jesus said about his disciples' pain. So what did Jesus say about his disciples' pain? Pain is what most of us are trying to avoid, but it is one of those places where our walk with Christ gets real. I mean, real pain. We can't audit that course. It gets real. So how do we walk through pain with Christ? Matthew's account of Jesus sending out his disciples is, I think, a primer in understanding what Jesus said about pain and persecution his disciples would suffer because of him, right? That's going to be part of the gig. If we're going to follow Jesus, we're going to have pain, and that's, again, a difficult subject. So what Jesus said, he said basically, because of him, beware of people, because they will hand you over to the councils and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be brought before governors and kings because of me, as a witness to them and the Gentiles, says Matthew chapter 10, verses 17 to 18. Now, true to form, Jesus didn't mince words, and he wasn't merely speculating on what his disciples might experience. Is this something that might happen? Is it might not happen? No, he's saying this is going to happen. Persecution awaited them like a trap in plain view. Can you imagine that, having to go through it, seeing there's a trap there for you? Jesus is saying it's going to happen, but we're like, I don't want to do that, Lord. That's why this chapter is so problematic, because we're humans, we don't want to go through that pain. And just as the disciples couldn't avoid their duty because of the fear of pain, their fear of pain, so we can't be intimidated of persecution. Surely we will face that, regardless of how dire our situation appears. Now, I have a great quote here from MacDonald, and he explains, they would be dragged before governors and kings for Christ's sake, but God's cause would triumph over man's evil. Man has his wickedness, but God has his way. In their hour of seeming defeat, the disciples would have the incomparable privilege of testifying before rulers and Gentiles. God will be working all things together for good. And of course, that references Romans 8:28, and we know that all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that leads us to lesson learned number 74, which is this: when following Christ, pain is as unavoidable as the promise is sure that the Spirit of the Father will be speaking and working through us. God speaks through our pain. The pain that Jesus endured about the greatest joy we could ever know. It brought about the great salvation. So we got to keep an eye on the prize. Even as we go through pain, we have to keep an eye on the prize. And in this last section here, I'm going to share a little bit about my journey to joy in pain, and just give you some details on that. It's embarrassing. So in my journey to joy, I'm talking about a very painful situation I went through. I'm laughing because it's so embarrassing. We hate it. We ignore it. We even try to hide it, but we can't avoid it, right? Pain. It comes in many different forms: physical, emotional, mental and spiritual, just to name a few. Now, we hardly need to define it because, we already know what pain is more closely than we have ever wished. I don't need to tell you what pain is. You already know what pain is. In my book, pain is a 4-letter word, but then I'm reminded that so is love. And it seems that love and pain are inseparable, especially when we're talking about God's word in the context of the biblical sense. So that's the point of this whole chapter. How do we know joy in pain? And I'm not going to share this entire story with you, but off the scale pain, early in my 20s, I developed something I thought only the elderly experienced. Embarrassed to say, large hemorrhoids. And before you I think that's about probably the most awkward thing I've ever said or gone through. But, before you skip this and turn this off, I just want you to know this. This story is short on glory and long on glory. So I'm amazed how God worked through that physical pain, the most physical pain I've ever experienced. And any future pain, I could only tie it. Just to keep the wretch factor low, I'm just going to say, I'm going to use the term that my colorectal surgeon called it, a tailpipe. So I'll call it, sometimes the pain was so severe I thought I was going to die. 11 out of a 10 scale. Very similar to back pain, this type of, tailpipe pain. Yeah, you couldn't relieve it. It was like back pain where you're sitting down or standing up or sleeping. You just could not run away from it. I basically went through a decade of these cyclic tailpipe issues to varying degrees of profound pain. It was clear, as time was going by, something was very clear. The frequency of my flare-ups and the intensity of my flare-ups were increasing, and only surgery could fix it. Now, somewhere, word of my surgery got around. I don't know how. I'm sure I said something. I don't think anybody leaked it. But, people were falling out of trees to tell me how painful this was. And I want to read some quotes here. "Oh, Travis, that tailpipe surgery really hurts," warned my grandfather. And a neighbor said, "Hey, I had that same lousy procedure. It left me out of work for a month." And then lastly, another friend told me, he said, "My wife said I cried every day for weeks afterwards." 4 weeks afterwards. So it led me to a lesson that I'll share here. And I'm going to save the full story for the book and how God got the glory. Lesson learned number 75 is this: you're not alone in your pain. No matter what type of pain you're experiencing, there are likely other people who've already also gone through it. Even in embarrassing types of pain, it's comforting to know that God isn't singling you out. And to me, that's very helpful. My fear of pain repeatedly drove me to my knees. "God, won't you please take away this pain? Can you hear me, God? Won't you take away this pain?" I kept praying that over and over. And I finally had to set up, put my own, my own needs of wanting that to going through and obeying God and saying, "God, this is what you have for me." So this is joy and pain. Let's do a wrap up here and we'll take it home. So we've come to the end of the podcast of joy and pain, from a family guide to joy in all circumstances. And just to wrap up, we talked about the centering statement of this chapter, which is Jesus knew joy because he anguished in pain. And just to review, that pain, as Christians, we're not masochists. We don't have to like pain. But pain is inexorably tied with our walk of faith with Christ, picking up our cross, following Jesus every day, and doing it joyfully, regardless of what comes, including pain. We talked about how Jesus went through and he anguished in pain on the cross. We also talked about what Jesus said about his pain and what his disciples, we as his disciples, he's speaking directly, of course, in the biblical text to his disciples, but even today, we are, as disciples of Christ, expecting to go through that pain as well. May not and probably won't be crucifixion, but certainly persecution and other forms of pain. And lastly, I shared a story, at least the beginnings of a story of how, through what I called off-the-scale pain, through a medical issue that I had. And I want to encourage you at this moment to not, as you're going through your life, as you're going through your relationships, your experiences, and we encounter pain, don't lean away from it, because that's our natural inclination, is that we want to lean away from it, but lean into it, because it is in that moment, it is in that experience that we can bear the cross, as it were, with Christ. We can walk closer with him. If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And in pain, this is such a very tangible way to follow Christ. Jesus knew joy because he anguished in pain as he walked to the cross. We can walk with him on our journey of joy. So long. We'll catch you next month. God bless.